Okay, let's jump right in. We're going to unpack a really crucial period of history today, the Visigothic kingdom in Spain.
Hmm.
And this isn't just some messy footnote after the Roman Empire fell apart. This was a civilization that lasted for nearly 300 years.
A very long time. And it
Yeah.
really laid the foundation for what would become modern Spain.
Exactly. So our goal here is to figure out who these people were, how they built such a stable kingdom when everything else was, chaotic,
Right.
and why their capital, Toledo, became such a huge center for power and law.
It's a fascinating story. And to really get it, you have to understand that the Visigoths weren't exactly strangers to the Romans.
What do you mean?
I mean, they were already part of the system. They were a Germanic people, sure. But for years, they'd been working for the Roman Empire.
As soldiers.
As soldiers, mercenaries, allies, they learned Roman warfare. And just as important, they learned the Roman way of life.
So they were insiders, in a way.
Kind of, but
Yeah.
then came the Great Migrations, this huge movement of peoples across Europe.
And that pushed them out.
It did. They first settled in what we call Galso, modern France, around 418, but they got squeezed.
By who?
Another rising Germanic power, the Franks. The Franks were really aggressive, and they pushed the Visigoths south, over the mountains, and right into the Iberian Peninsula.
So they're arriving in Spain, not as conquerors necessarily, but more like powerful refugees.
That's a great way to put it. They just lost their territory, and they weren't marching into an empty land.
Right. The Hispano-Romans were there.
Millions of them, people who had lived under Roman law and culture for centuries. So this shift wasn't instant. It was a long, slow process of negotiation, conflict, and eventually a blending of two cultures.
And not just conflict with the locals, right? The peninsula was already pretty crowded.
Oh, absolutely. To get that stability they're famous for, they first had to prove they were the toughest group on the block.
Who were they fighting?
They had to deal with the Suebi up in the northwest and also the Vandals.
The Vandals, I've heard of them.
Yeah, but luckily for the Goths, the Vandals were mostly just passing through on their way to North Africa. Still, the Goths had their hands full just taking control.
Okay, so a question. When the Goths took over, what happened to the rich Roman families? Did they just disappear?
That's a key point. No, they didn't vanish at all. The Roman aristocracy stayed incredibly powerful.
How?
They still owned most of the farmland. They dominated the cities. The Visigoths were the new military and political leaders, but they had to rule with this existing wealthy class. It made things complicated at first.
But eventually, the Visigothic kings did manage to centralize power.
They were relentless. For decades, it was just constant campaigning, subduing rivals, building new forts.
And by when did they control most of it?
By the middle of the 6th century, so the 550s or so, pretty much the whole peninsula was under a single Visigothic king.
That's a huge achievement for that era, to create one of the most stable post-Roman kingdoms in all of Europe.
A massive achievement. And none of it would have worked without a central command post.
Which brings us to Toledo, the capital. Why Toledo?
Its location was, well, it was a stroke of genius, tactically speaking.
That's so.
Just look at a map. It's on a high hill, and the Tagus River wraps almost completely around it, like a giant natural moat.
So it's easy to defend.
Incredibly easy to defend. And it's centrally located. The king could send out troops or orders to almost any part of the kingdom very quickly. It was the kingdom's nervous system.
And it became more than just a military base.
Oh, much more. It became a symbol of royal power. You'd have seen huge churches, government buildings, the king's palace.
A place to impress people.
Exactly. Where he'd meet his advisors, his dukes, ambassadors from other kingdoms. It projected power.
And big decisions were made there too, right?
The most important ones. Major religious councils were held in Toledo. And these weren't just about faith. They often created new national laws that everyone had to follow.
Which would naturally draw people in.
Of course, merchants, skilled craftsmen, they all flocked to the city to support the royal court. It became a bustling economic hub.
You know, talking about the king's power, I find the way they chose their kings really unique. It wasn't always father to son, was it?
No, it wasn't. The Visigothic monarchy was often elective.
So the powerful nobles would actually vote for the next king. That sounds almost modern.
It does, but it was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it meant the king had to be strong and popular to even get the job.
But on the other hand,
it made the throne a constant target. This system caused endless internal fights, plots, and, frankly, a lot of assassinations. Noble families were always scheming to get their guy on top.
okay, wait. If the monarchy itself was so chaotic and full of backstabbing, how did the kingdom stay stable for 300 years? That seems like a contradiction.
It is a paradox, isn't it? And the answer is the one thing that was stable: the law.
Ah,
Because the kings came and went, sometimes violently, they relied on a fixed written code of law that applied to everyone.
and this started early on.
Yes, with something called the Code of Uruk. It was an early attempt to sort of blend their Germanic traditions with the more sophisticated Roman laws that were already there.
But that wasn't the final version,
No, the real masterpiece was the Liber Udiciorum.
the Book of Judges.
Exactly. It was introduced by a king named Receswinth, and it was revolutionary because it was a single set of laws for both Goths and Romans.
That is a huge deal.
It is. It covered everything from property disputes to murder, and by creating one law for everyone, they got rid of a major source of tension that other kingdoms struggled with.
So the law provided the stability that the monarchy lacked.
Precisely. It was considered the most advanced legal system in Europe at the time, and its ideas influenced Spanish law for hundreds and hundreds of years.
So even with this unified law, society was still very divided, wasn't it?
Oh, extremely rigid. Based entirely on who your parents were and how much land you had, it was almost impossible to move up.
Can you break down the classes for us?
Sure. At the very top, you have the nobles and the bishops. They owned most of the land. Okay.
Then you had free citizens, small farmers, merchants, craftsmen. Below them, serfs.
They were tied to the land, right? Not quite slaves, but not free.
Exactly. And at the absolute bottom were the slaves, who did the hardest labor and had few, if any, rights.
And it's important to remember that the Visigoths themselves were a tiny minority in all this.
A very small minority ruling over millions of Hispano-Romans. So for their kingdom to survive, they had to merge. The shared laws helped, and so did intermarriage over time.
But there was one other huge barrier between them.
Yes, religion.
They weren't all the same kind of Christian.
Right. The Visigoths were originally Arians. It's a different form of Christianity. The local Roman population, however, was Catholic. And this difference created a lot of tension between the rulers and the ruled.
Until one king made a huge political decision.
A monumental one. In 587, King Record decided to convert. He made Catholicism the official religion of the entire kingdom.
He announced it at one of those big councils in Toledo.
The Third Council of Toledo, yes. And this was the ultimate move to unify the kingdom, because now the church was on his side.
A powerful ally. Bishops became royal advisors. They helped write laws. That shared faith basically erased the last big cultural barrier between the Goths and the Romans.
So, with everyone unified, what did their economy look like? What was driving it all?
It was almost entirely agricultural. Based on farming and raising livestock, most people were out in the country working on those huge noble estates.
And what were they growing?
The Mediterranean basics: wheat for bread, grapes for wine, olives for oil. They were still using heavy wooden plows pulled by oxen, just like the Romans did.
What about animals?
Huge herds of sheep and goats for meat, milk, and wool. Trade continued, but it was much slower than in the Roman era. They did keep the gold and silver mines running, though.
For coins and...
And for luxury goods, which leads to their art.
Right, they were masters of metalwork.
Absolute masters. They're famous for these beautiful votive crowns.
What's a votive crown?
It's a crown made of gold and gems that a king would donate to a church. They didn't wear them. They were hung over the altars as a sign of piety and wealth.
And in their buildings, they introduced something that became an iconic feature of Spanish architecture.
The horseshoe arch. You see it everywhere in later Spanish buildings. Their churches were small and sturdy, thick stone walls, tiny windows with these really intricate carvings.
And through all of this, what language were they using for government and school?
Latin. It remained the language of law and learning, and that education was run by the church.
Monks in monasteries copying books.
Exactly. That's how knowledge was preserved. And you have to mention one person here: Isidore of Seville,
Scholar.
maybe the last great scholar of the ancient world. He wrote a massive encyclopedia trying to summarize all human knowledge. That book was used as a textbook across Europe for centuries.
So all of this, the law, the culture, the economy, was protected by a strong military.
It had to be. The king led the defense, but he relied on his dukes across the kingdom. Every noble was legally required to provide soldiers and equipment for the army.
What did that army look like?
Mostly cavalry soldiers on horseback with spears and swords, and then infantry guarding all the stone fortresses. They were well equipped, and for nearly 300 years, they kept the kingdom safe.
Which makes their sudden collapse even more shocking.
It all fell apart so quickly, And it goes right back to that fatal flaw we talked about earlier.
The elective monarchy, the infighting.
The infighting. In the year 711, an army from North Africa crossed the Strait of Gibraltar.
The Visigothic king Roderick went to fight them.
He did, at the Battle of Guadalete.
Right.
But because of all the feuds and rivalries, some of his own nobles, his own dukes, abandoned him in the middle of the battle.
A betrayal.
The ultimate betrayal. Roderick was defeated, and the central government in Toledo just collapsed, almost overnight.
And the invaders took over most of the peninsula within a few years.
They did. But the Visigothic legacy didn't just disappear. They had successfully bridged that chaotic gap after Rome's fall.
And they left behind a foundation.
A foundation of written law, a unified Catholic faith, and a cultural identity that would define Spain for centuries.
So if you think about it, the great irony is that they created one of Europe's most stable kingdoms, not because of their kings, but because their system of law was strong enough to survive them.
That's the key takeaway.
Good luck with your studies.